Welcome to Military Analytics. The Russian army is completely cornered and unthinkable. Operation was carried out on the ammunition train going to Solder, and the Russian army is the biggest trouble ever. Putin was furious when he heard this, and the Ukrainian army is now mobilized to win the biggest victory against the Russians in the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The Ukrainian army started to take very different steps. Ukrainian soldiers have begun to take over a very big victory against the Russian army at the heart of this latest successful operation. Very important steps taken by Ukrainian intelligence. The Ukrainian army organized a massive operation against the train, which was considered one of Putin's last hopes. It is possible to say that Russia has recently faced huge problems within the army, as well as internal turmoil. In addition to this, with the successive victories of the Ukrainian army, certain fronts are on decline. Due to the steps taken on the Bakhmut front, which is considered the most important front for Putin, the Ukrainian army has now taken success in many areas. Therefore, Putin has decided to send a large number of military ammunition and equipment towards the Bakhmut region. This decision was revealed thanks to the information obtained by Ukrainian intelligence, and the Ukrainian military immediately begun consultations to assess the possible routes of the train. This consultations revealed that Russia could only support Bakhmut via Zaporizhia. This information would launch Ukraine's unthinkable operation. The Ukrainian army mobilized its most important equipment, the Ukrainian special forces, against the Russians. Ukrainian soldiers ambushed at the point where Ukraine could organize the easiest attack in the region and start to wait for the signal from the observation units. This signal was recorded as the signal that would change the fate of the war in every field. In addition to laying mines on the railroad tracks, the Ukrainian army also laid many C4 bombs. These remote-controlled bombs were capable of doing anything to cause enough damage in that area. When the news came that the train was coming from Moscow towards this area, rocket launcher systems were immediately set up on the hillsides nearby. This would allow the Ukrainian army to secure the operation. When the Russian train started to approach the area, the Ukrainian army's observation units were informed about the situation, and they took their positions and waited for the Russian train to passive. Then the ammunition train got closer. The remote controls for the bombs were prepared, and as the train passed over the tracks, there was a huge explosion. When the Ukrainian army detonated the front part of the Russian train, the train derailed and moved towards the clearing. Since there was not a big enough explosion, the soldiers inside went for their weapons and moved to fight. The Ukrainian army started firing rocket-propelled grenade launchers at the rear of the train, one after the other. But at this point it could not be determined in which carriage Russia was carrying the explosives. Surprisingly, in the clash with Russian troops started to take the lead. This was due to the heavy weaponry. At the same time, the Russian army informed the Kremlin of the big ambush. But the truth was different. The Ukrainian army had hacked into the radios in the area, preventing the Russian train from communicating with the center. It was the Ukrainian army that needed reinforcements. Therefore, the Ukrainian army decided to retreat by delivering the calculated coordinates of the immortals, and the Russian army suffered one of the biggest damages. This great success of the Ukrainian army laid the foundation for the Russians to be completely cornered in every field. And when the missiles started raining down, the Russian army started running left and right. Russian soldiers who did not expect Ukraine to carry out such an organized operation were at a loss. Some of them surrendered, leaving their weapons so that the bombardment would not continue. A huge train of ammunition was left behind. The Ukrainian army was not in a position to carry them. Therefore, the Ukrainian army had a different plan for these trains belonging to the Russian army. Knowing that Russia would send a large number of soldiers to this derailed train, they immediately placed the remaining C4s in the wagons with explosives by evacuating the area. The Ukrainian army had once again made it clear that the Russians would return empty-handed even if they came after the C4s were detonated. The sound was heard throughout the region. Although a large number of troops from nearby Russian military headquarters were directed to this area, when they arrived, they found literally nothing. The Ukrainian army began to celebrate the victory by marching towards the capital, Kiev. But when Putin received the news of this explosion, things got completely confused and Putin's decision resonated around the world. Russian President Vladimir Putin is now taking different steps in many areas since the beginning of the war. The army has been destabilized by the loss of about 200,000 soldiers. This has caused a lot of turmoil, and a lot of people within the country have been venting their frustrations, as the Ukrainian army turned the tide in its favor by taking steps in these areas. Putin tried to squeeze Ukraine from different angles, but while this unjustified invasion attempt increased support for the Ukrainian army, it never justified Putin. In particular, the frequent use of embargoes against Russia was not welcomed by the Russian people, who were struggling with unemployment and many other crises. But on this issue, the change in the occupational distribution in Russia has shown a start that will resonate all over the world. Many Western companies have withdrawn from doing business in Russia. In addition, the Putin administration, which could not reassure investors, started to characterize things as a very big problem because the Russian ruble continues to lose value against foreign currency. This causes the Russian people to lose in terms of purchasing power day by day. But the bigger problem is that people cannot find a job to work. Many people in Russia are unemployed and waiting for news from their relatives they sent to the army. These people have to face Putin's wrong policies every day. Because of this, there are constant uprisings and people coming out to rebel against Putin. If this trend continues, it is only a matter of time before Putin faces even bigger problems. And how is the Putin administration responding to the rising unemployment after these Western companies have withdrawn from the country? These facts are completely blood-curdling. Putin employs the unemployed people for the burial of the soldiers who died on the front. In other words, it has come to a point where you can get a job as a gravedigger or a priest. This is further fueling the growing economic problems in Russia. The increasing need for gravediggers and priests reveals once again what a bad strategy the Putin administration is pursuing. In addition, things are getting even more complicated as Putin has begun to take control of the money that will be given to the relatives of the war victims. This paves the way for Ukraine to gain more power in many areas. The Russian army, on the other hand, is facing new casualties every day and is acting as if to show the world that even greater difficulties are imminent if things continue like this. Putin is expected to fall from power in a very short time, but the comments of war analysts in this field underline that very serious problems have only just begun. According to war analysts, Putin is expected to make much bigger breakthroughs in a short period of time. But the Russian people are very worried about these new breakthroughs because every imbalanced policy of Putin paves the way for harsher embargoes on the Russian people and more support for Ukraine. If things continue in this way, the Ukrainian army is expected to triumph in a short time. This is because many people are encouraged by the outstanding success of the Ukrainian military, especially in foreign policy. Putin, on the other hand, does not know what to do after this war as he has completely wounded Russian foreign policy. The Ukrainian army is conducting operations against the Russian army from almost every direction. As the harsh winter months started to give way to warm spring, the war in Ukraine started to heat up. The Ukrainian army has recently carried out a series of attacks on Russian targets, including the Russian port area and troops in Krasnodar Oblast and the Russian military air base in Yeysk. Let's examine the stunning details of these attacks together. The onset of the winter season and the unfavorable ground for ground operations pushed the two countries, which were fighting against each other, to trench warfare, artillery, missile, and UAV attacks. The artillery units of the Ukrainian army, the HIMARS and 155mm squared howitzers they used during the winter period, caused the Russian army to suffer huge losses. In addition, the Ukrainian army, which fends off Russian air attacks with the advanced air defense systems Ukraine bought from Western countries, gave Russia a hard time with its own UAV power. Although Russian President Vladimir Putin trusted air defense systems a lot, this trust was in vain. Before the new year, the Ukrainian army's attack on two air bases in the interior of Russia, and especially the UAV attacks on the Russian elements in the Crimea, showed that there was a great weakness in the Russian air defense. Putin blamed his commanders for this weakness in air defense and fired many commanders from the army. This was to offer the Russian people a kind of scapegoat. Putin did this many times during the war. The incompetence of his army and failure to make any gains in Ukraine brought the blame to his commanders. And Sergei Sirotkin, who was the last appointed head of the Ukrainian forces, was fired from his post. Ukraine made good use of this faltering of the Russian army. Its operations, both at the front and across the border, were shaped by this faltering, and the Ukrainian army gained the upper hand over the Russian army. So what should the Ukrainian army do to maintain its superiority? The firepower of the Ukrainian army has reached very high limits, and Russia has almost no equipment, weapons and soldiers to counter this firepower. Relying on its forces outside of Ukraine, the Russian army is trying to dispatch these forces to Ukraine in order to strike a blow to these efforts. The Ukrainian army continues its attacks on key points of Russia. In the morning of the previous day, an explosion and fire broke out in an oil depot in the Russian port of the Krasnodar territory. As a result of the drone attack, the infrastructure of the oil depot belonging to the Rosneft company was damaged. The exact number of drones that participated in the attack on the oil depot was not disclosed. But judging by the photos of the local population, the attack had extremely serious consequences for the oil storage base. In the photos taken by the residents of the neighborhood, it turned out that the fire that started after the explosion was quite strong. Its consequences could not be eliminated for quite some time, and fire and a huge pillar of smoke could be observed from a distance of several kilometers. It was not specified what type of drones were used for the attack by the Russian authorities, but it was reported that several hours before the attack, pods of the drones carrying large quantities of plastic explosives were found on the territory of Belgorod. The extent of the damage to the Rosneft oil depot has not yet been stated. But the fact that the UAVs have reached the Krasnodar region once again show us how ineffective the Russian air defense is. The drones, which the Kremlin say were launched by Ukraine, flew deep into Russian territory, including those that entered within 100 kilometers of Moscow, demonstrating breaches in Russian defense when President Vladimir Putin ordered increased protection. So what do so many drone attacks by Ukraine indicate? Officials said the drones did not inflict any injuries or cause significant damage, but yesterday's attacks raised questions about Russian defense capabilities. Ukrainian officials did not immediately take responsibility, but similarly refrained from directly accepting responsibility for past attacks and sabotage while emphasizing Ukraine's right to strike any target in Russia. While Putin did not refer to a specific attack, his comments came hours after drones targeted various areas in Russia's south and west. Authorities closed airspace over St. Petersburg in response to what some reports said were drones. Again, Russian officials warned of a missile attack, which they blamed for the hacking attack. According to local Russian officials, the drone strikes targeted areas along Russia's borders with Ukraine and deeper in the country. A drone crashed near the village of Gorbatov, less than 100 miles from Moscow. The drone did not cause any damage, but likely targeted a civilian infrastructure object. Pictures of the UAV showed that it was a small Ukrainian-made model with a range of up to 800 kilometers, but not capable of carrying large amounts of explosives. Russian forces claimed that another Ukrainian drone was shot down over the Bryansk region. 3 drones also targeted Russia's Belgorod region, with one flying through an apartment window in the capital. Local officials reported unmanned aerial vehicles reportedly caused minor damage to buildings and cars. Some Russian commentators have described the drone strikes as Ukraine's attempt to strike behind the lines, fueling tensions in Russia and demonstrating its ability to mobilize the Ukrainian people. Some Russian war bloggers have described the raids as a possible rehearsal for a larger, more ambitious attack. Drone attacks could herald wider attacks within Russia that could accompany Ukraine's attempt to launch an attack. UAVs attacking targets behind Russian lines will likely be part of this attack. Ukraine is clearly trying to expand the range of its UAVs again. Officials said that Russia's second-largest city, St. Petersburg, and that all departures and arrivals at Pulkovo, the main airport, have been suspended. Authorities did not specify a reason for the move, but some Russian reports claimed it was triggered by an unidentified drone. Last year, Russian officials repeatedly reported shooting down Ukrainian drones over annexed Crimea. In December, the Russian military said Ukraine used drones to hit 2 bases for long-range bombers deep inside Russian territory. Speaking at Russia's main security agency, the FSB, Putin urged the service to increase security on the border with Ukraine. Ukraine's attacks seem to have created an indignation within Russia. This could clearly be Ukraine's direct message to the Kremlin that they have the war advantage. In another development that escalated tensions across Russia, an air raid alert interrupted the programming of numerous TV channels and radio stations in several regions. The Ministry of Emergency Situations of Russia said that it was a scam caused by the hacking of the servers of radio stations and TV channels in some parts of the country. The inadequacy of Russian air defense and Russia's inability to provide air security has alarmed Kremlin officials, including Putin. Frankly, it is not clear how many UAVs the Ukrainian army has with kamikaze UAVs, but we can say that the number is quite high with this UAV army. It is among the possibilities that Ukraine will make a solid attack to end the war. In this case, although Ukraine's partners say that cross-border operations will escalate the war, they should support Ukraine in this regard and provide Ukraine with all the ammunition it needs. Otherwise, this war will continue, and the two countries will consume each other, and it will be against civilians, as in any war. Ukrainian forces are putting up a great resistance against the Russian army in Bakhmut while the Russian forces were attacking with all their might. They also started to deploy their elite soldiers to the region for the spring months. However, Ukrainian forces continue to increase defensive measures so that the attacks of the Russian army do not reach their goal. In this legendary war, Ukrainian forces made a move that the Wagner mercenaries of the Russian army could never have predicted, and trapped them. Ukrainian forces use Ukraine's geographical topography to their advantage. How Ukrainian forces stuck Wagner mercenaries on the line of death. Let's examine in detail how the Ukrainian forces intercepted the Wagner mercenaries fighting for the Russian army in the direction of Bakhmut. The land of Ukraine is full of hills, steppes, harsh forests, raging rivers, and bridges connecting them. Bridges are strategically key elements for many purposes. They can be used for both defensive and offensive purposes. At the same time, since bridges are the only and shortest way, this predictably makes bridges primary targets, although strategic. So what if the bridges on the Bakhmut front collapsed on the Russian forces? Victory for the Ukrainian forces has become a habit now, especially in the Bakhmut region. The Ukrainians carry out tactical attacks in order to take advantage of the Russian forces. With these attacks, the Ukrainian forces managed to hold Bakhmut until now. Vladimir Putin, who wanted to take control of the Bakhmut region, started to move a large number of elite Russian soldiers to the region with the approach of spring. The arrival of elite Russian soldiers in Bakhmut may further strain the defense of the Ukrainian forces. However, the Ukrainian commanders are making all the necessary moves to solve this problem. Ukrainian warriors achieved an important victory in a huge battlefield. However, military officials are cautious that they are still vulnerable to Russian attacks from other directions. Ukrainian forces prepared many buildings for war in the Bakhmut region, able to open fire from fortified buildings. Ukrainian warriors have made this critical area a killing zone. This would likely make it very difficult for Wagner's forces to attempt to continue their frontal assault in this direction. Or Wagner forces will continue their attacks, risking huge losses. This move doesn't make sense, but Russian forces made very few sensible decisions throughout the war. After firing from the killing zone, Ukrainian fighters destroyed important bridges in the Bakhmut area and cut off the offensive route of the Wagner mercenaries. This dealt a major blow to Vladimir Putin's goal of Bakhmut in its latest intelligence update. The UK Ministry of Defense stated that in recent days, Wagner Group forces have captured most neighborhoods in the eastern part of the Donbas town of Bakhmut. The UK Defense Ministry has stated that the Bakhmut River in the city center, which gives the city of Bakhmut its name, is now the front line between Ukrainian and Russian forces. Ukrainian forces control the western part of the city of Bakhmut and have destroyed important bridges over the river, which runs north-south from a 200 to 800 meter wide strip of open space between areas with civilian housing. Ukrainian forces removed the bridges, making it difficult for Russian forces to launch an offensive. However, Russian forces regained control of several key points on the outskirts of Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces took a significant advantage by launching multiple attacks on Russian supply lines. This tactic helped Ukrainian forces regain control of many areas. Now, Russian forces can attack the supply lines of Ukrainian forces west of Bakhmut from their temporarily occupied points on the outskirts of Bakhmut. Supply routes in the west are considered vulnerable by Ukrainian commanders. For this reason, the Ukrainian commanders are on the alert for possible attacks by Russian forces from the north and south, while devising new tactics to protect the supply routes. At the moment, the Ukrainian forces are carrying out heavy attacks on the Russian forces in these regions so that the Russian forces do not attack from the north and south of the supply routes. The attacks of the Ukrainian forces prevent the Russian army from moving from the defensive position to the offensive position. While fierce clashes and tactical wars continue in Bakhmut, the most curious subject is how the spring months will pass in Bakhmut and its outskirts. Let's take a look at how the Russian and Ukrainian forces are preparing for the spring offensive. Working hard day and night with our expert staff, we strive to deliver warm information and special analysis from the front to you as quickly as possible. You can support us with the super thanks button below. The expectations of both sides regarding the spring offensive, which we think will be the biggest war we have ever seen, are very high. While the Russian forces want to capture Bakhmut and advance towards Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, the Ukrainian forces drive out the Russian forces and want the Ukrainian lands to be completely liberated. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is deploying his best troops in Bakhmut to achieve his goal. This military activity will be completed before the spring, and the Russian forces will launch an all-out attack in the direction of Bakhmut when the weather conditions become favorable. However, in recent days, several failed attacks by Russian forces have weakened them and given the Ukrainian forces time to strengthen. The Russian forces suffered heavy losses, and the Ukrainians largely achieved their target in Bakhmut and greatly consolidated their fortifications in the region. If Russia sends its elite troops to Bakhmut in an impromptu manner, Ukrainian forces will be able to neutralize more skilled Russian soldiers. This will cause the Russian forces to weaken more rapidly. About this situation, the Kiev government made the grim assessment that continuing could see Russia's losses far outweigh its own. In order to inflict maximum damage to the Russian forces, the Ukrainian forces will fight to the end. In the city of Bakhmut, where Russia has begun to place its best troops ahead of Ukraine's planned spring offensive. Recently, the Kiev government stated that they had received their receivables in Bakhmut and that there was a tactical possibility of withdrawing from the city. But the Kiev government seems to have backed out, with a combination of Russian troops and mercenaries operated by the private Russian Wagner group shifted to Bakhmut, desperately trying to achieve their first victory. Months later, the Russian forces changed tactics by deploying large numbers of elite soldiers to the region. The Kiev government was convinced that keeping Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut would result in more casualties for Russian forces. Mikhailo Podolyak, an aide to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, stated that the Russians changed tactics. Podolyak pointed out that the Russians united in Bakhmut with the bulk of their trained military personnel, the remnants of their professional army, and private companies. According to Podolyak's statements, the Ukrainian forces have two new targets. The first is to reduce the capable personnel of the Russian forces as much as possible and to stabilize them in several important grueling battles disrupting their offensive. The other is to concentrate Ukrainian resources elsewhere for the spring counteroffensive. We would like to remind you that recently it was stated that Bakhmut did not have a critical structure, and what made it critical was that the leaders put pressure on Bakhmut. However, with the Russian forces changing tactics, Bakhmut reached a much more strategic position for the war. The decision of the Kremlin government to send hundreds of thousands of regular soldiers, reserve officers, and mercenaries to Bakhmut will cause the most violent clashes of the war. Moscow points out that capturing Bakhmut will open a hole in Ukraine's defense and will be an important step towards a big target of capturing the entire Donbas industrial zone of Ukraine. Russian forces are trying to gain an advantage in the eastern part of Bakhmut and the suburbs to the north and south. However, the Ukrainian forces are quite determined not to allow this. Deputy Defense Minister Anna Malyar stated that while Russia continues its offensive, Ukrainian soldiers are doing everything possible to prevent the Russians from carrying out their plans. The fact that the Russian forces deployed more trained soldiers in the Bakhmut region where there has been great activity in recent days, and that the Ukrainian forces abandoned their withdrawal plans indicates that we are approaching a great breaking point for the war. Whichever side wins as a result of this breaking moment will result in a serious collapse for the other side. The Ukrainian forces can easily come out of this collapse by holding on to their long-time victories. But we can say that the end has begun for the Russian forces and the Kremlin government.